Thank you, Anne. Thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here, pleasure really to be able to talk to you and share some of my ideas and experiences as an artist and writer. Now, let me first say that it is a challenge for an artist to fashion a career on three separate continents in this increasingly globalized era. In Europe, in contrast to America and Australia, there are centuries-old traditions that continue to shape the economic, political, and cultural sphere. Europe has social structures that are more hierarchical, and consequently, within the art world, artists frequently depend on mentors or superiors to open doors for them. These hierarchical relationships also exist in the United States. For example, going to Yale School of Art certainly can lead to influential connections, but they are not as available as they once were. Indeed, in the US and the globalized context today, artists often cannot rely on these specialized networks. They have to be much more entrepreneurial. In Australia, artists must take into account the very different natures of the two major art centres, Melbourne and Sydney. Melbourne has more of a tradition of patronage of the arts, and it is particularly the Jewish community that has played a major role in developing this tradition as collectors of the visual arts and patrons of the theatre. Another distinctive feature of the Melbourne art world is that curators open doors. This means that a successful career is often dependent on having the backing of one of the strong curatorial voices in the community. Initially, opportunities come about from artist-run spaces, and shows such as these can draw the attention of important curators. Then artists go on to gain commercial representation. Now, this history of alternative spaces began in the 80s with art projects, and successive generations of artists have kept the model alive. The Sydney art world also has major collectors, but it does not seem to have the same collective patronage of the arts as the Jewish community in Melbourne, nor has it had, until recently, the same tradition of artist-run spaces outside of the dealer network, and so artists have to develop their own initiatives. Now, any artist who wants to have a full-time career depends on the situation in the art world of a given period. In New York, the art world of the 1970s had a very specific structure, but it changed in the 80s and the 90s, and then again in this last decade. In this lecture today, I want to look back at that world, focusing on the subtleties of it, paying particular attention to the museum and gallery system and the transformations that took place from the 1970s to the present. In doing so, I shall reflect on the artistic choices available to artists generally in the cultural climate in which we were living and working from one decade to the next. Specifically, I want to talk about the choices I made during those years in order to structure my career. Now, I arrived on the New York scene in 1972 and entered the graduate program at Hunter College. During those early years, in order to gain some understanding of the New York art world, I went to openings, I talked to my professors, and kept my ear to the ground, and slowly began to discern three spheres within the New York art world. One was the well-established, commercially successful galleries on 57th Street, and they showed this kind of work. The second was the cutting-edge galleries, mostly downtown in Soho, which introduced artists such as Richard Tuttle And the third was a network of alternative spaces scattered throughout the 3 boroughs of the city. Now, each venue offered artists unique opportunities and different points of entry. So I'd like to go back and just give you sort of a little bit more details about each of those particular spheres. So I'll go back to the 57th Street galleries. Now, these particular dealers managed all aspects of the artist's career. They strenuously promoted their artists to collectors and the public and offered yearly exhibitions, which meant that the artists remained highly visible in New York. Another huge advantage was that these galleries attracted serious curatorial attention, which led to museum shows for the artists and major recognition. Additionally, the artists gained access to a sophisticated international network of galleries that led to exhibitions and exposure in the European market. Last but by no means least, the gallery secured the financial footing of its artists, allowing them to devote themselves full-time to their art. The downside of this deal in the 1970s stemmed from the financial arrangement that permeated the relationship between artist and gallery. Ralph Humphrey, an artist and one of my academic mentors, informed me of the pressures and limitations that existed for painters functioning within the gallery system at that time. The system rewarded a crystallization of style, which meant taking one idea and executing variations of it, making a predictable and therefore marketable commodity. Too radical a stylistic change could jeopardize one's position in the gallery. Now, this tended to inhibit an alternative and more creative model based on exploration, risk-taking, and experimentation. Ralph cautioned me that it was difficult to balance one's integrity as an artist while acknowledging the commercial realities. This type of representation affected the artists in other ways, as the gallery maintained control over the work, leaving the artist dependent on the dealer for access to collectors, curators, and critics. Now, the more cutting-edge galleries showed the radical work of emerging artists, and these galleries attracted a younger generation of curators, which shaped trends and offered museum recognition, which would take the artist to a whole different level. However, artwork sold for less because dealers were younger and had yet to develop a wealthy client base. Nevertheless, it was not easy for an artist to secure representation by these dealers. Often, doors were opened by the prominent established artists of that time, such as Sol LeWitt, Alex Katz, and Bryce Marden. But this had a striking effect on the art on view in these galleries, as it was most often influenced by the aesthetic judgment of a select few artists. In the beginning of my career, this is how I had an important breakthrough in New York when Ralph Humphrey introduced me to my first dealer, Max Protege. But I'll come back to this a little bit later and talk a bit more about it. Now, many painters, including myself, exhibited in both the downtown galleries and alternative spaces. The alternative arts movement served the important function of challenging the status quo of the uptown gallery system. Most artists showing in these venues define themselves as anti-establishment and anti-institutional. They made work that was experimental in nature and turned away from traditional modes of painting and sculpture and developed new forms such as this, performance art and installation and video art. The ongoing civil rights and liberation struggles helped fuel the vitality of this scene as artists were personally committed to the issues and responded artistically. Low rents and the availability of unoccupied spaces, as well as the preeminence of New York as a financial center contributed to the flourishing of this network. So too did the ready availability of federal funds, which was not restricted at this stage by the content of the work of the shows. Now, the alternative spaces could be found in all boroughs, including Harlem and the South Bronx, but most were concentrated in Soho. The earliest were in semi-abandoned city buildings and functioned as testing grounds where artists presented their work while still in a raw and innovative state. They used unexpected materials or defaced and intervened with the architecture, making challenging, adventurous, and intellectually driven projects. Now, these artists, such as Gordon Marta Clark, knew that art on the margin of the mainstream had the potential to become part of the dominant culture. In effect, this happened with video art, which at that time could find no outlet in museums or commercial galleries, and so was first shown in 1974 at the Kitchen, one of the first alternative spaces. By 1977, however, video art was featured at the Whitney Biennale, and the catalogue contained a substantial section devoted to it. Because shows at the alternative spaces resulted in few sales, often artists had to find other ways to earn their living, and these were often weird, random jobs which they did part-time. This is quite the opposite today, when New York artists need a larger income and are mostly supported as teachers by academic institutions. Now, during this era, the downtown bar scene was an important milieu. This scene was highly significant for artists and their careers because of the contacts they made and the relationships they developed. It was there that I began my friendship with Martim Avilés, a Portuguese intellectual who introduced me to Silvia Lotringer, who was the editor of this publication. Semiotext was an influential journal founded in 1974, which attempted to combine the intellectual melting pots of New York with the avant-garde, so that French theory and avant-garde was brought together. Lotringer invited me to be an editor, part of the editorial board, in 1978, which greatly influenced my artwork, which I'll also discuss later. Another intellectual figure in New York at that time was Tom Bishop, who was at NYU. He had an unusual talent for bringing artists and intellectuals together, including the leading French theorists. Tom formed a group called the Colloquium on the Theory and Practice of the Avant-Garde that facilitated a dialogue amongst artists and intellectuals, and it was there that I met Roland Barthes, Jacques Derrida, and Michel Foucault. Now, let me talk about the choices I made during the 1970s. At the beginning of the decade, I wrote my thesis on Rothko under the guidance of Ralph Humphrey, a brilliant artist and teacher who really contributed to my development as a painter. Ralph had that rare gift of perception, a kind of insight into which dealers knew how to run their business, yet also possessed a vision about the direction of contemporary art. He opened the door to the Max Protech Gallery, believing that it would be the proper context for my work, and that's where I had my first show, one of my first shows in 1976. Max's gallery was known for the backroom discussions that took place and its intelligent and sophisticated staff. Now, two important exhibitions that resulted from my connection with Protech were at the Whitney and the Guggenheim Museums. The Whitney mounted this new image show in 1978, which documented how recognizable personalized imagery had begun to re-enter abstract painting. My work contained images that fluctuated between the abstract and the real of bridges, boats, and vessels. Now, beginning in the 1980s, there were important changes as the small 1970s art world mutated into a major market-oriented profession. When a conservative Republican, Ronald Reagan, was elected president in 1980, he tilted strongly towards corporations and the upper and upper middle classes because of tax and regulatory changes, both for individuals and corporations. Together with higher corporate profits, there was a massive upward redistribution of income. The incoming conservative administration criticized the National Endowment for the Arts, which funded contemporary exhibitions and artists on several fronts. Now, conservatives were unable to abolish the NEA, but they drastically cut its funding in the early part of the decade. And the critiques were later revived by far-right critics, such as Senator Jesse Helms and Patrick Buchanan. In 1989, these right-wing politicians and religious leaders began attacking government funding for contemporary art, targeting imagery such as this that they found offensive or pornographic. They pointed to Mapplethorpe's homoerotic photographs and as indicative of the excesses of the NEA. Now, government policy had a major impact on the alternative art sphere, which was dependent on the patronage of the state and federal agencies, including the NEA. By 1983, the NEA had imposed rigid regulations and accounting procedures that forced the alternatives to become professionalized. Formerly, autonomous artists had to become financial experts who understood marketing and personnel issues, and over time, many alternative spaces, in order to gain NEA funding, needed an administrator to develop policy, funding, scheduling, and record keeping. But as the decade progressed, the non-profits adopted the operating style and values of corporate culture. To qualify for NEA grants and tax benefits, they had to establish a board of directors and be legally and fiscally accountable. Wealthy and influential people were recruited to raise money and reassure funders that the alternatives were financially responsible. The outcome was that instead of being alternative and oppositional, many spaces became fully fledged institutions part of the mainstream. Now, during these years, another factor threatening the well-being of the alternatives was a series of real estate booms linked to art districts. Rents in Soho and Tribeca skyrocketed as these neighborhoods became investment opportunities for developers. The disappearance of affordable space had a significant impact on the alternatives and non-profits, and after about a decade, many of them lost their homes. Now, as artists were pushed out of Soho and Tribeca, the East Village art scene emerged. Many artists didn't like what the alternatives had become, and in response, between 1981 and 1984, over 70 experimental commercial art galleries opened in the East Village. In essence, this scene played with the traditional concepts of a gallery. Located within a 14-block area, these commercial galleries experimented with different ways of market presentation, functioning more as a hybrid gallery social space. They featured a mix of fashion, graffiti painting, music, performance, and video. However, within 5 years, due to high rents and gentrification, the scene had dispersed. It was not only the fact that government higher rents that jeopardized the status of the alternatives. There was also an ideological shift within artists such as Cindy Sherman and Nan Goldin themselves. This generation did not want to present their work in the semi-abandoned warehouses of the alternatives, as they had a totally different aesthetic. A lot of the art in the early days of the alternatives was process-oriented and interfaced with the unfinished state of the exhibition space. But this changed with the emergence of the neo-expressionists and the pictures generation, which Sherman belonged to. These painters and photographers turned away from the industrial as-is nature of the alternatives and opted instead to present their work on conventional white walls, implying that the concept of the alternative was found in the art itself and not in the viewing space. In 1982, there were 74 alternative spaces, but these venues quickly lost their vitality. By the end of the 1990s, the whole notion of the alternative was entirely outmoded, as major galleries represented these artists and museums featured their work regularly, thereby legitimizing it. But from my perspective, the most profound change in the New York art world took place in the sphere of the mainstream commercial galleries. They took center stage as they seemed to be the most viable way for artists to gain recognition, have their work seen and distributed, and earn a living. Formerly, the commercial galleries would try to get their artists recognized by museums. But as art became valued more and more as a commodity, dealers shifted their emphasis away from shaping their artists' careers to simply selling their work. They brought their artists onto the marketplace, making a lot of money for them and launching them as celebrities. As the market value of the work increased, the reputation of the artist escalated, and all this seemed to happen without the intermediary of museums. Instead of the museums shaping the art world, it was now the marketplace. About this time, art began to function as an investment. As opposed to previous decades, when collectors were motivated by a deep commitment and genuine appreciation for art and artists, with the increased distribution of wealth in the 1980s, people began to see contemporary art as a commodity from which to make money, an investment vehicle fully equal to stocks and real estate. Dealers such as Castelli and Sonnabend ushered in a new style of collecting when they began to talk about contemporary art in monetary terms. They spoke to a new kind of buyer, men who loved art but were not blind to its value as long-term investments. Many of these new collectors were heads of corporations, real estate firms, and financial industries. Frequently, the corporate entity itself was a significant patron of contemporary art. Corporations hired curators and consultants to form major collections for investment, as well as to enhance the corporate image, and learned from dealers about which art was undervalued. As private collectors bought art on a speculative basis, they also used advisors, and soon after some of them established foundations and garnered tax credits. During this decade, many younger collectors were influenced by the new style of collecting and went on a speculative binge to make money from art. By the mid-1980s, the auction houses had seriously entered the contemporary art market. This was primarily due to Saatchi, who's formed a really huge collection and shaped really the new generation of collectors by his example. So widespread speculation appeared as collectors resold works they had owned for only a short period of time and made hefty profits. Now I'll locate myself in this decade and explain what I did. In contrast to the crystallization of style that the commercial galleries fostered, my own creative process was based on exploration and experimentation and probing the unknown, rather than repeating motifs and imagery. At the beginning of the decade, largely through my association with Semiotext, my work became to reflect French theory, which argued that forms of representation in art were regressive, and it changed significantly. My paintings in the 1979 Whitney New Image show, as you can see here, contained recognizable shapes, painting on the right. Yet, even when these paintings were shown, I felt myself drawn into this other direction. My use of figurative elements diminished in favor of abstract markings, dots, and grids. The shadowy silhouettes of figures and furniture gave way to ciphers and linear markings that were involved and imbued with multiple indefinite meanings. Now, for several years I continued in this vein, but in 1985, when my interest in French critical theory shifted, I began exploring a different aesthetic, one closer to the non-Western traditions of other cultures, including that of Australia. I traveled extensively through Asia and Europe and discovered the Kathakali dance drama in Cochin in India. By 1986, several working residencies in India and Italy began to influence my painting, and over the next 5 years, through trips to Bali, Japan, Thailand, India, and Burma, I continued studying the traditions of other cultures, focusing on Eastern thought, especially the writings of Ramanujan and Alan Rowland, which led me to write my first book, Metonymy in Contemporary Art. Now, a lot of opportunities opened up for me during this decade. By the way, this gives you some illustration of the work that I started doing during that period. Aside from the 2 residencies in Italy and Montauk, I did a significant paper-making project, etc. But in 1987, I married a New York native, Frances Claps, who's here today, who's not involved in the arts, but who has supported me emotionally and been behind whatever I've wanted to do as an artist, which is pretty important, especially for a woman artist. Now, in the 1990s, the situation in the art world and the choices facing artists changed again. In 1991, the downturn in the Asian economies spread worldwide. The art market collapsed, and prices of works by Picasso and the modern masters, as well as top contemporary artists, fell dramatically. While the recession affected sales of major artists worldwide, there emerged new developments, including the expansion of the secondary market to include photography and installation work, and a heightened interest in notions of gender, identity, sex, class, and politics. Most importantly, a major transformation of the art world occurred due to globalization. This was all facilitated by the web, which in the early 90s. Now, the Internet's effect on visual content may be the most dramatic shift as artists search the web with immediate access to source material and imagery, constructing works that range from ephemeral performance to immersive installation. It also made it possible to share documentation of work happening everywhere. In a way, the Internet has replaced the urban centers as a forum for dialogue and critical presence. The expanding Internet also facilitated the globalization of the art world. Prior to the 90s, biennales were major national and international exhibitions that featured only Western artists and were only held in Western countries. But then in 1989 came the earth-breaking, or sort of groundbreaking rather, exhibition by Jean-Hubert Martin called Magicien de la Terre, which introduced sacred and tribal art, not as primitive with its inherent assumption of Western superiority, but out of an interest in embracing diversity. And so the exhibition showed, say, Indigenous art from Australia alongside major Western artists such as Richard Long. From this time on, diversity and inclusion became standard in the emerging globalization of art. The impact was especially felt in the nature of the biennales. The numbers exploded. In 1985, there were 5, and now, more than 20 years later, there are 45. Non-Western artists exhibit, as well as curators and organizers, alongside Western mainstream artists, all under the rubric of contemporary art. Now, the steps that I took to reshape my career in the 90s grew out of the events at the end of the 1980s. In 1991, my Indian paperworks were included in exhibitions in Sydney, Melbourne, and New York. And while in Australia for these shows, discussions began with 4 curators about a comprehensive exhibition and accompanying catalogue of my work. Now, with this opportunity, I arrived at a crossroads in my career that brought a major shift in how I pursued my professional life. And I guess this is the reason why I decided to write this book, to sort of share with you how I proceeded from this time and how, in a sense, I maneuvered and structured a career that's very different to the conventional one whereby dealers organize and shape and determine totally what happens for artists. I mean, I've always worked with galleries, but I structured a whole different way as well, and that's what I'd like to outline. So, Brenda, in during this period, I was fortunate to have someone in my life, Brenda Moore, who recognized the implications of the opportunities of this major survey show for my career. Brenda was a sophisticated insider with insights and skills about cultivating my network of supporters that she was willing to share with me. She mentored me as I redirected my professional life. Now, Brenda made clear that I would need to be more assertive in order to achieve my goals. She urged me to turn my eyes to Europe. She thought the Australian retrospective could be a vehicle for entering the scene there, and she encouraged me to seek European venues for the show. On a practical level, this was a wise move in light of the severe recession afflicting the New York economy, which meant that major commercial galleries were intent on selling the work of their established artists rather than taking on new artists or shaping the careers of their mid-career ones, such as myself. So Brenda perceived that to succeed in Europe, I needed to position myself not only as an artist, but also as an intellectual in order to overcome the gender bias. At her urging, I began writing in order to open up a dialogue with European curators. My articles appeared in Art Press in Paris, Art Monthly Australia, Art in Australia, and Q, a journal published by Cornell. Brenda also encouraged me to explain my ideas in my paintings, in my conversations and meetings with curators. Prior to this, artists, I think, always counted on the belief that the artwork would speak for itself. But this time I began to realize that I had to be actively and intellectually involved in order for the curators to extract any underlying meaning in my work. Now, in order to approach museums as potential partners for my show, Brenda helped me to use my network more effectively. She advised me to contact other supporters, curators, editors, academics in both America and Australia to gain introductions to their European colleagues. In approaching these people, I quickly learned to be upfront letting them know concisely what I would like them to do for me. This meant overcoming my natural reticence, which wasn't so easy, I must say. But I figured out how to do it. In 1991, accompanied by Brenda, I made my first intensively scheduled business trip to Europe. Over a period of 19 days, we managed 31 meetings with dealers, editors, and curators in 9 cities in 3 countries. As a result of this trip, galleries in Berlin and Milan became involved with my work and later exhibited it, and my association began with the journal Art Press in Paris. Most importantly, I formed relationships with German museum directors who continued to provide guidance and support. I discovered that these face-to-face meetings were essential to promoting an active career, and since that trip, I have made at least 1 and sometimes as many as 5 business trips to Europe each year. Now, by following Brenda's strategy, I was able to get commitments for major museum shows. In 1996, the Art Gallery of New South Wales agreed to mount a retrospective, and then several American museums agreed to participate in the tour. Largely due to the complexity of negotiating the loans and the high cost of transporting the artworks, it proved easier to have 2 different shows, one in Australia and another in the US. Next, discussions began to explore the possibility of extending the tour to Europe. However, the trajectory was not straightforward or smooth. I encountered a major obstacle: fundraising. In Australia and Europe, museums are funded primarily by the government. Nevertheless, it became clear to me that to guarantee a show in Europe, I had to participate in securing some part of the funding. In the US, funding usually came from the NEA, with matching funds from corporations, but by 1997, several American museums had made commitments to my show when again the NEA's funding was severely cut, and accordingly, museums began finding it difficult to mount shows of contemporary art. I knew from that point on that unless I played some role in gaining sponsorship for some of the expenses of the show, the exhibitions would not happen. So, as it turned out, in the US too, I ended up playing a major role in securing funding for the transportation and the catalogue, while the museums covered the bulk of the expenses related to the exhibition. Now, it was at this stage that serendipitously Colby Collier entered my life. For the last, and again, the things that he taught me were so, I don't know, outside, beyond, different, my way of thinking as an artist, and yet, it proved to be so effective that I tried to outline in the talk today and in the book some of the strategies that I used, because in the hope that, giving back in this way, that it may guide you, inspire you, influence you in your own careers. So as I was saying, the last 15 years, Colby has played a crucial role as my mentor, teaching me how to generate funding for my museum shows. He came from the world of academic and medical center philanthropy, so he brought a whole new perspective, one very different from what holds sway in the visual arts. The first thing that Colby said was that if I did not play an active role in soliciting support, no one else would. He spelled out in great detail a multi-pronged approach that involved collectors, corporations, embassies, and other benefactors. He counseled me that corporations would likely not be the primary, he counseled me that foundations would not be the primary source of support. Funding the retrospective of an individual artist rarely accords with the mission, the mission statement of a foundation. That was hugely important because it saved me a lot of time seeking support from that source. Kolbe said, to raise funds in any field, the first line of approach should always involve individuals. In my case, seeking sponsors for a museum show, he advised me to approach collectors who had already purchased my work. However, to cultivate them as sponsors, I needed to appeal to them not only on the basis of the quality of my work, but also its reputation in the art world. To that end, rather than showing them images of my recent work and trying to explain my newest ideas, I would show them installation shots such as these that I'm, illustrating this talk with. And I also prepared a list of institutions that had acquired my work in depth, noting how many works they had purchased. He encouraged me to convey the uniqueness of my position as an Australian-American artist receiving recognition by major New York museums and having a retrospective exhibition in prestigious venues in the West. According to Kolbe, collectors would be reassured if other influential people, art institutions, and embassies had endorsed my project. He explained that when museums show my work, it gives collectors an opportunity to publicly provide support, linking their name to an important institution. Not to be overlooked, the professional affirmation of my work increased the importance and value of their collection. Concerning my efforts to gain corporate support, Kolbe advised me that one person alone is usually empowered to make a decision about sponsorship. Unless I talked with this key person, my efforts would fail. My approach needed the endorsement of someone with a personal or professional relationship with this top person. There were, of course, benefits for the corporate sponsor, such as prominent acknowledgement in the catalogue and in all promotional material for the exhibition. I was fortunate to have both the US and Australian embassies' endorsement and support, and in some cases, the ambassador paved the way, introducing me to key decision makers within the corporation. Due to Kolbe's input and guidance, I raised $90,000 for the US tour from individuals, grants from the Australian government, and one foundation, the Nathan Cummings Foundation, one of whose members owned my paintings. For the European tour, $25,000 was raised for the catalogue to accompany the exhibition in Austria. This was accomplished in an unusual way, relying on advice from my Australian accountant, Tom Lowenstein, as well as my two lawyers in Sydney, Penelope Jaffrey and Keith McConnell, who raised most of the money, soliciting donations from their colleagues. The money was then channeled to a museum foundation so that contributors could get a tax deduction. As an expression of my gratitude, each contributor received one of my drawings. A major Australian graphic designer, Brian Sadgrove, designed the publications in exchange for an artwork. Both venues on the German tour received grants from the US and Australian embassies. For the exhibition at Kleve, I created 2 editions of etchings at the Savannah College of Art and Design, which the museum sold to its supporters, and the money raised went to pay for the catalogue. So with Brenda and Kolbe as my mentors, negotiations led to retrospectives shows that toured between 1999 and 2006 in the US, Australia, and Europe to 10 museums in 6 different countries. My role in securing private or outside funding was a significant factor in the ultimate success, of mounting each show. An important byproduct of the museum shows enabled me to financially continue my career as an artist. Many collectors who contributed funding also bought works from the museum exhibitions. Furthermore, in Europe, I was able to establish gallery representation in cities close to where the retrospective exhibition took place. Without the museum shows, my work would never have gained this kind of representation. Most vitally, I learned how to structure a different kind of career which was not solely dependent on the gallery system in New York. Because of this, I've developed an international career on 3 different continents, which is facilitated by my writing about art and by my developing relationships with museums and having important museum shows. Now, again, I want to say, throughout all of this, I've counted on the strong support and backing of the galleries that represent my work here in Australia and Europe and New York. I'm not arguing against gallery representation. I'm saying that they provide crucial backup to the museums. But I think in taking initiatives such as I've tried to outline today, I've wanted to convey to you that you, in fact, can support the galleries, by seeking this kind of museum support. So if you have any questions, I'd be very happy to answer you, and I hope I'm glad to. Yes.
Thank you very much, Denise. I'll field the questions if you like.
I'm just curious how difficult you found it to balance your studio practice with all this entrepreneurial activity.
Well, it's a huge challenge, but it really is, because you have to balance the making of the work with all of this outreach and all of the thinking through of the various initiatives. But the fact is that more and more today, and from what I can see, if you do want to have an active career, you have to take it on. No one will do it for you. If you sit back in your studio and make the work and don't have an outlet for it, that is not going to, contribute to the development of what you're doing. One of the great bonuses of the outreach that I made in the meetings and the dialogue that I established with museums, especially, and with galleries, is that they give you feedback about the work. They give you opportunities to show it. The galleries, of course, on the front line of doing that. The museums have very long-term planning. But the curators, they don't want to just know, where you've shown. They want to know what your ideas are, and they comment, and they help you go further. The galleries, by showing the work, also stimulate the work. If you don't show the work doesn't progress. I think you have to put it out there.
Was your studio always in New York? Or did you work?
Yes, it has always been in New York. I have always been. That's a good question. I never thought about that, but I did my undergraduate studies in Paris, and I had a studio there, but certainly was not showing my work to anyone.
Oh, you were. And do you have assistants working with you?
I do. In New York, one of the great resources, I think, are the availability of students and interns and people who learn. Sometimes I don't even pay those assistants. There are programs run by various universities that place students in with you so that they can gain some insight in what you're doing. But at other times, I do hire graduate students and very, very smart, astute people who are really on the ball, who help me a great deal.
Painting on the prints as well. I'm not familiar with all of your images. Do you make prints?
I do. As I mentioned, I made one important 4 editions actually to support one of the museum shows. So but I've made prints with Landfall Press and with Illinois State University. So I've worked with a number of different presses. Yeah.
Yes, there's a question.
Thank you for that talk. It was extremely interesting. Yeah. Can you predict where the art scene's going to go next?
No, I think it's so. I think it's so diverse. I mean, what I do see is that more and more non-Western or not non. You'll see more and more artists, I think, coming from seemingly third world countries who will, you know, get picked up in major centers like London, New York, whatever, and combine their language with modernist traditions. I mean, you'll see that, and then you'll see a lot of the Western artists who automatically have access to a globalized market just being pushed and promoted. So, I don't know if this is clear. It's funny because I was just asked to respond to that in a thing that's in Art Collectors, and I thought about it a great deal and figured it out how I understood it, but I can't seem to say it clearly here. But I mean, what I'm saying is that you're just going to see the diversity continue for sure. There's not going to be just one stylistic trend as there had been in the 80s and then perhaps in the 90s. I think you're just going to see diversity. Yeah.
Yes.
Hi. Thank you, first of all, very articulate presentation. And also, it's not usual that we have an artist who talks about the business of art.
Right, yeah.
There's honesty in that. But also there's concern, because I don't really know how to put this question down to you, but we lived in a long time where, well, previously there was isms in art. And now we've come to a point where it's contemporary art, and which encompasses all art. And it pretty much kicked in around the same time as you mentioned with the corporatization of collectors.
Yeah.
Now I wonder if all of this corporate embodiment of art has actually annulled that kind of the direction that a group of artists can work within, because it's being diffused by the collector, the curator.
Yes, yes.
We all want to be the artist who works up in the garret and becomes found. But it seems now that we have to go through this kind of traverses walk of business and corporatization and appeasement in a way. How do you feel with contemporary art now?
It's the marketplace that's determining. It is collectors who choose to purchase certain kinds of works that have enormous power right now in terms of what gets shown, what the museums are also embracing and seeing as the most relevant work of this era. Previously, it was museum curators, I think, who had the ability to perceive trends, to argue very persuasively that certain kinds of work reflected an era, and that then the marketplace got behind that. But that has gone. It's art fairs. It's a very, very powerful speculative marketplace, and there's no way that I think you can fight that. And there are always only going to be a very few top artists who will be promoted by that kind of a system. But what I would like to convey in my talk today is that that system is there. That's, it's just, you can't, if you want to get rid of the whole capitalist system, you'll get rid of that, but that will be a huge task, right, I guess. It doesn't mean that you can't structure a different way of having a career. It doesn't mean that you are defined by it. It doesn't mean that you are inhibited or that you are shaped by that.
I don't see it so much as a personal affliction, afflicting me personally. I see it more of I see it as a sad time historically. I think if another 100 years, they look back and 2000, the noughties, I think it's going to be quite a dull period in art.
Yes, it's so hard, isn't it, to it's so hard to make that kind of judgment call, though, I guess, because within all of that, I mean, certainly you could sort of certainly form an opinion about the dominant work that's sort of that the marketplace is behind, that's corporate driven. But there are so many interesting things happening as well. Major artists showing in museum shows that like I often check out eFlux, that site that lists all the major shows. It's astonishing what's going on. It's astonishing how people can work around it. And that's what interests me, I think. To just let the whole corporate model and the corporate-driven, powerfully market-dominated work or something, sometimes it's very interesting, actually. But there's so many other ways. And I think what is necessary as an artist, a practicing artist and thinker and curator and critic, whatever, is to just not be somehow too influenced by that dominant node, to just find other ways, find other models, have a dialogue with people who are seeking. I mean, I can remember when the minimalists, such as Sol LeWitt, a brilliant guy who's certainly a major presence on the marketplace now, but he couldn't. Sol LeWitt, Mel Bachner, Carl Andre, all those artists couldn't really get major support in New York, and their trajectory was to go to Europe and find galleries who did support them and who understood their work, and then they started getting recognition in the US. And so I think it was different, but they struggled hugely against a dominant aesthetic and attitude at that time. So it's a struggle for most generations.
Denise, on that note, we're right on 2 o'clock. We do have another class probably coming in a few minutes. Please, thank you very much indeed for a very polished presentation, and that opens up another kind of way of thinking about the forces that drive an artist's individual practice. So thank you very much indeed. Please.